Welcome to the second NSS Town Meeting. I thought about doing my Ross Perot imitation, but I think I did that joke at the last ISDC, so we'll just let it ride. We had an early town meeting on Friday to let people voice concerns and questions before the board meeting. Now we're having a late town meeting, even though it's early in the morning, on Monday to let people voice questions and concerns after the board meeting. And if you want to voice the same ones, that's fine with me.
Sorry.
Everybody's a comedian. I'm going to leave about 11. I have an early flight to catch. Don't be offended if I happen to jump up right after somebody asks a question or makes a comment. It's just my schedule, not my attitude. Alan, Lori, you have anything to say before we take questions and such?
Not particular. We're here to answer your questions. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, not really. If people want us to talk, I could, but
This could be a very quick and easy meeting. Yeah, go ahead.
Looked like you were finishing up, Alan. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off.
I am.
One of the things that the society, I think, is perhaps having some trouble with is trying to sell the importance of space, particularly the U.S. Congress, when they're always looking kind of for a single mission focus. The idea of, space will give you 500,000 things is too nebulous and broad and difficult for them to grasp. It's certainly often difficult, I think, when we talk to people in the street, But with the publication of the article by Ben Bova and Ann Astor here just a few months ago on solar power from space, this has always been kind of an underlying theme for a lot of us in the society. Is there any thought on the part of the staff of the board that trying to put a focus on one extremely tangible and extremely high value product from space and trying to devise a program that gets us there, it'll have the benefit of getting us all the other things we're looking for. You've got to reduce cost of orbit, you've got to have people in orbit in order to be able to work on these things, so on and so forth. Is there any thought about trying to use that as a tactic for selling space to Congress?
Yeah, there's.
Very well.
I suspect you can hear me even without it. I've done a lot of study on that question, which is why I grabbed this one. I keep hunting, I think it is the holy grail, to find the one issue that is really so good that it does that. The truth is, none of them are. I did years ago, and I continue to look at the question of, is there an economic driver that would pay for everything else? And if there were one, that would be wonderful and we could support it wholeheartedly. But the truth is, it looks like it's going to take a group of separate factors, each of which contributes to the cost. Solar power satellites really aren't ready to be the driver for space. If we focus entirely on that one, we lose. We can be refuted. As in generally, when you're trying to predict the future, there's going to be something we never thought of at all that's going to come along out of the blue, and we have to be ready to jump. But in any case, you can do it with a combination of returns from a lot of different sources.
Yeah, I'm not allowed to. And
hold it anyway. That's really cool.
from the neck down. You can analogize it if you want to the computer world. I mean, there wasn't a single thing that took computers from being a curiosity of government laboratories to something that was ubiquitous. It was a combination of things. I mean, mainframes got big in private industry, mostly to process personnel information. But then it sort of stalled. Everybody said, well, that's what computers are good for. Maybe one day when they're cheap, they'll be really big, and everybody will have a terminal in their home tied to a giant computer somewhere. And that's what everybody thought until well into the 70s. Then personal computers sort of came out and they sort of dribbled around, but they were sort of a curiosity for hobbyists until you sort of got things they could do. And there were a bunch of them. It was electric pencil was sort of the first one, and then WordStar, and then Lotus really was what sort of pushed things along. And, the uses people put them to were myriad. I've been looking, I think the ideal economic driver for large-scale human entry into space is tourism. And there's a lot of good stuff. Wolfgang Demisch, who some of you may be familiar with, has done a pretty decent economic analysis of space tourism and how that can really drive costs down and capabilities up, but only after you get to a certain takeoff point, which we haven't reached yet. And that's why I think, you know, cheap access to space and such is important, because you've got to get the cost down to the point where you get to a takeoff point. We're not there yet. So the next question you might ask yourself is, okay, what can help us get to that stage? And that looks like a mixture of government R&D, which is why we're trying to push things like Delta Clipper and, you know, all these other proposals as well. Lockheed has a good one. And market demand, because, I mean, the way you get things cheaper are through two factors. One is you move up the learning curve, you get better at it. And the other is you spread your fixed costs over more units. And actually those go hand in hand. So what you gotta get is volume. Well, right now the thing that gets us volume of launches, get that kind of experience, looks like something that the space activists seem sort of inherently dull, which is LEO communications apps and remote sensing and stuff like that. And I was a little disappointed. We had an article in Ad Astra, and we had a whole lengthy discussion on how well Ad Astra was sort of really pushing our vision and making it clear. And one illustration is we had this excellent article on Iridium. Told you all about Iridium, well written, nice. The one thing it sort of missed, and Richard Wagner, the editor, agreed this and said, you know, if I thought of it, I would put in a sidebar. The thing it missed was the sidebar that says, the really cool thing about Iridium, and even more so with Teledesic, is if they do it, look how many launches they have to buy. Look how much people start thinking of this as a market to serve rather than as a sideline to their business selling launches to the government. And that's what it takes to get people working on making launches cheaper and better and driving costs down, just the way it did with computers when people quit saying, a computer is a thing we sell to a big organization of the government that sits in a room that's air conditioned within an inch of your life and is tended by a somewhat obnoxious priesthood of data processing guys who won't let you approach the great god IBM too closely. And when people started thinking, no, a computer is something that everybody needs, then the question was, how do we get it to them at a price they're willing to pay? How do we make it do what they want? And that's continued to drive costs down and capabilities up to the point where Sony is putting out a 400 MIPS game machine next year. Something that would have been on the munitions list and forbidden for export 10 years ago because it was so powerful. And that's the kind of dynamic we want to get going in space. But I think we need to look at it as a process, not as an event, not as something you can do with a single thing. You know, the original L5 vision, the original thing that was going to get us off the planet was solar power satellites. And you know, with the right scenario where the Arabs paid no interest to their economic self-interest, but just quit pumping oil forever, might have made that a viable prospect. But unfortunately, they're smarter than that, and they realize that oil in the ground isn't really worth much to you if you don't sell it. And SPS looks like a longer-term thing now. I mean, I think long-term, I think it's still tremendously valuable and important. And we've tried to push the sort of small-scale stuff, you know, demonstration projects, so that all the pieces of the puzzle will be there when we're ready to put them together. And the technology's come a long way. You know, the amorphous silicon solar cells are getting better than 10% efficiency now. And I mean, you know, all the pieces of the puzzle are getting better because a lot of it depends on electronics, which is growing by leaps and bounds, and material science, which is growing by leaps and bounds. But it's not there yet. You can't, in any plausible scenario with existing technology, deliver solar electricity to Earth at a price that can compete even with nuclear, much less with hydroelectric and other stuff.
Just a short follow-up, that even if it's not been a single mission that would be credible to try to sell to Congress or that they would buy off on, does it work at all with anyone in Congress? And also, more specifically, given that we have the environmental vice president, does it work with him, or have we tried that with him? Have we tried the SPS idea on him specifically? He would seem to be an ideal target for this kind of thing because it ties, you read his book, and a lot of the things that he notes that are problematic in the global environmental catastrophe he cites can be related back to problems with energy production and the after effects of that in one form or another.
If you read the speech Al Gore gave at the IAF opening in Malaga a few years back, which we kind of wrote for him, it does say that kind of stuff. And I think he's sort of receptive to that. The problem with Al Gore, well, it's not really a problem, is he's suspicious of big government programs because it's been his experience they don't deliver. He felt like he got really badly burned with SDI. Edward Teller came in and lied to him, which basically Edward Teller did do, and said, we already know how to make X-ray lasers that can knock a missile out of the sky right now. Just give us a whole bunch of money so we can deploy them. Of course, that was crap, and he sort of felt like they got sucked into that. That was why he was lukewarm on SEI, that and the fact that NASA guys came to him and said, we're not actually for this. Who cares what George Bush wants? So it's hard to go in and say, yeah, I mean, and this goes to how we sell everything, I think. This goes into how we sell Delta Clipper. I don't think we go in and we say, here's the program we want that'll give you great results if you just give us another $10 billion. Politicians just won't buy that anymore. And you know, they're probably right not to. I mean, you know, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me 30 times, shame on me. But what you can say is, here's a path that looks good, and the next step on that path to figure out what you want to get costs $100 million. And if that looks good, it's another, it's like poker. You know, you pay to see the next card. And if you don't like what you see, you fold. And that's a different sales pitch than what we're used to. We're used to saying, you know, look, here's where you take the lunar materials and they go to the mass catcher in lunar orbit, and then they're smelted into stuff that feeds automated beam builders, and we make O'Neill colonies. That's our dream, that's not their dream. And they just don't buy that stuff anymore.
If I could respond to one other aspect of your question about having one sort of silver bullet answer that can generate a lot of support. Although I don't recall this being discussed at the Board of Directors level, the Board of Governors spent a lot of time on it at their last meeting, and they feel strongly that the society needs that one silver bullet for us to all rally behind. And they point to the success, of course, of the Planetary Society that has been a lot more narrowly focused on their vision than have we. I've discussed this at length with Lou Friedman. Their exploration of Mars is something that they can keep driving home. They have a lot more members than we do, and I think that is one of the reasons. The Board of Governors did agree that we ought to be pushing Mars exploration as their silver bullet. We could never agree on a silver bullet for the society. I think, you know, obviously the Board of Directors focusing on space colonies is our overriding driver. But if you listen to the chapters, what they're all doing for all the awards last night. Look at the tremendous diversity of things that people do. Look at when a volunteer chapter organization puts together a conference and all the things they want to discuss. We're not that kind of society. It's just going to pick one thing. And maybe it would be better in garnering more membership, but it's not something so far that we have decided to do.
I think maybe we have an advantage though, because we're open to different ideas. We can say to people, come join us, do what you want to do, and move in the same general direction. I think our members may be more activists because of it.
Definitely. Okay.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is that we should not be trying to sell the silver bullet to the government. One of the most exciting projects I heard about this weekend was Margaret Jordan's work with the sounding rocket. The government involvement there was the waiver, getting the government out of the way. Maybe these incremental steps should be taken more by the private sector, the people who are putting sounding rockets together because they love it, the people who are putting communications constellations in low Earth orbit because they expect a profit, and us concentrate on getting the government out of the way.
Yeah, I think we've discussed this in strategic planning as well, as far as who is your customer and where is your message focused. And many of us believe it should be focused, and our customer is more generally on the public, and others feel that it is those government regulators. What we have agreed on, I think, is a combination of both, but the primary customer is in fact the public, the potential membership, the folks who can then, who we're doing this for. And if there's what we call gatekeepers, are the government folks who can regulate it, can license it, can and sometimes pay for it. But that should not be our primary target, at least of NSS, maybe Space Plaza is.
Yeah. I think that the great appeal of the old approach, where you just basically said, look, if we can find the government and get them to buy off on our program and get all we want, is it's the fairy godmother approach, right? And you take the ruby slippers, you tap them together a few times, you say there's no place like L5, and there you are. And it's worked, right? I mean, it's worked for us before. That's actually the most dangerous part about it is it's worked before. You know, Werner von Braun managed to pull that trick off several times. Sergei Korolev managed to pull that trick off. I mean, and if you can do it, it's great. You know, all of a sudden you don't have to worry about money anymore. The government just sort of keeps backing dump trucks full of cash up to you, and you get what you want. The trouble is, it's very hard to sustain. You know, the trouble with fairy godmothers is they don't actually exist. And the other approach, while it's more practical, I think, it's not as good for our own morale because there are a lot more intermediate steps. I mean, it's one thing to say, all we have to do is craft the silver bullet message, hit the target, and the government, zombie-like, proceeds to do our bidding. It's another to say, well, we got to push for little LEOs, that'll bring some costs down some, then we got to push for something bigger, then maybe we can finally start to see some space tourism take off, and with economies of scope and scale, we'll see launch costs drop into the $50 to $100 pound range. Then we can start thinking about really large space structures. SPS will become economical. I mean, that's the real path if you want, you know, a plausible path to space colonization. But it's got a whole lot of little steps you got to do. There's no sort of magic wish your way to completion. And that, I think, has been harder for people to get their minds around. Maybe we haven't sold that well enough with ourselves.
It's relatively boring.
I mean, the truth is, the key question is does it work? The fairy godmother can sometimes be fooled, but the reality is reality, and eventually they're going to discover that, in fact, at this time, for example, SPS, if you really do the arithmetic, is not ready to be the driver, and is quite a ways away. Everything else, the same thing can be said. So if there really were a truthful silver bullet, we'd be all over it. But there isn't. We have to do it this way because it's the only one that's realistic and true.
Tim,
Switching gears a little bit, with the unlikelihood, hopefully, that space station does not get killed this year. If it does, what does the staff's and the board's plan to protect shuttle? Because there's been some words out in the papers and so forth, and that the next thing after the opponents of space station get that killed, shuttle's next. What are your thoughts on that scenario, if it should occur?
Our biggest worry has not been protecting shuttle per se. We have, and this is not for broad distribution, but we have been doing our post-station implosion counter-budget analysis to figure out what to propose. And Scott Pace has done a lot of work on this, actually, because, well, he does that stuff for the administration on the other side, so it's handy. It's a tricky question because the first thing is, the assumption we've had is that if they kill station, we get a consolation prize. They throw us a bone. They take away, you know, we lose $1.5 billion a year, but they say, find something you can spend $800 million a year on. And we say, okay, here are some things that are pretty cool, which would be probably cheap launch R&D, maybe some sort of ISF type thing. And you know, the trouble with that is, the pattern where they've killed stuff this year has not been that. You know, the superconducting super collider guys didn't get a bone, you know.
They got buried.
Yeah, they got a big hole in the ground in Texas full of fire ants is what they got.
And the administration has specifically said space station is what they care about. And if it goes, they're going to lose interest in space and move on to something else.
So it's going to be very difficult. And that's my problem. If I was czar of the universe and I could roll the clock back to 1984, I would have set us, knowing what I know now, on a very different path than the one that we follow. But that's not where we are now. And the question is what we do from here. We will try hard to do what I've suggested if that happens. But I don't want to suggest that it's going to be as easy as everybody thought it might be a year ago. It's not. I mean, where people want that money to go is deficit reduction. I mean, that's what they want, or which really means veterans and housing.
I just saw something interesting happen, that two board members here sort of agreed on a path to get into space, which is a really rare thing. What you were both saying is that somehow by promoting the commercial space sector, that ultimately, there's some probability that we will win. What's interesting about that, there's a metric involved, and that is all the activities of the society, should we follow that path, we measured by the growth of the commercial launch industry, either in commercial launches or total dollars. And whenever you conduct an activity, it's always important to have a metric, and it seems to me that this...
I would love that metric for two reasons. One is, we've been working, and actually partly out of pessimism about things like station and shuttle and government space in general. We've been putting more effort into commercial space for several years now. And there's sort of two reasons for that. One is the path that I laid out, which seems plausible. The other is the sense that if the government stuff implodes, we want to make sure there's something left. I mean, I don't worry about what happens to the federal budget to decide whether I can get a personal computer or not. I know the market will take care of that. And that's what we want the commercial space area to be like. The reason I'd love that to be the metric is that commercial space has gone a long way. Since 1990, revenues have gone from $2.9 billion a year to $5.5 billion a year. So since that coincides, strangely enough, with my tenure as chair of the policy committee, you can throw the I would, however, suggest that the trouble with using something like that as a metric is that it would be like using the stock market as a metric for presidential economic policy. I mean, the commercial space market, which of course we do, but we're idiots. The commercial space market moves according to a whole lot of causes, only some of which are anything we can control. So while I'd love to take all that credit, I think the most we can do is sort of help.
It seems sort of maybe it's coincidence, but 1990 was the year that the Launch Service Purchase Act was passed along as well. And I would like to suggest that at least a number of launches serve as a metric.
Yeah.
We look at it.
Yeah, that's probably right, and I'd be interested to talk with you more about that because I'd like to see what we can do. I think that commercial space is going to happen. We had sort of a false dawn in the 80s, and it could have been a real dawn, actually. I mean, if a few investment decisions that in retrospect should have been made had been made, and a few others that were really stupid, at least in retrospect, weren't made, we probably could be a lot further along than we are now. But everything had to happen right in the 80s for us to be ahead of where we are now. Now, things are going to get better unless things go wrong. And one of our big efforts is to try and stop things from going wrong. We can't prevent a worldwide depression or a war or the kind of things that could independently interfere with it. We can work with the regulators. One of the things we want to try and do is carve out a sort of safe harbor for model amateur rocketry, like the Pacific Rocket Society, because we're operating in a sort of gray shadow zone of regulation right now. And we'd like to kind of protect that area a little bit by pointing out to people that all the great advances in rocketry were actually done by people who were more or less amateurs, such as the Robert Heinlein Award winner, Robert Goddard.
Before we continue, if I could just make an announcement, because I know people are coming and going. We have 2 videos available here for people to take home, and one are the National Space Society public service announcements with a Star Trek cast that been shown earlier, and another is a space station video provided by Boeing for people to use to help demonstrate the value of a station. So I'm going to put the box towards the back, and as people come and go, feel free to take them. Take a couple if you have people who can use them. We have about 100 of each. And we'll show these at the end of our program. Sorry.
Tail in the back?
Yeah, a comment I want to make on some things you were saying earlier. I see the switch over of a lot of people looking at an incremental approach to this as very much a sign of maturity in the space movement. The whole idea of the fairy godmother, as you had put it, is a very childish thing. It's somebody, if you're really good little boys and girls and you do just the right thing, the fairy godmother is going to come across and give you everything you want. Whereas this is coming to the conclusion that you actually are the ones that have to make the plans, do the work, set the goals, get a little bit here and a little bit there and make it happen yourselves. I think it's a very, very healthy sign for us.
I'll make a prediction that when we look back in hindsight at what did get us into space, it will be something that at this meeting we never thought of.
Yes, and your support of amateur rocketry is commendable, but I think we should also consider those who are going to ride the rocket. I mean, such as groups like Garver represent Experimental Space Craft Society, who's trying to put a payload on the market. A little support along those lines is always welcome.
We'll be glad to.
Lynn, as you were talking about the process of pushing a little here and pushing a little there and trying to make it all come together, it occurred to me that it sounds remarkably like the process of trying to take a third world economy and bring it up to the next level. And in fact, that's what we're trying to do. And I'm thinking maybe a little more attention to the analogy might help us with it.
Well, I think it is. Actually, I think the best analogy is a special case of that, which is the efforts to achieve economic reform in formal and communist countries. Because really space existed for a long time as a command economy. You know, the government decided what it wanted and it got it. Nobody worried about the price. And now we're trying to turn it into a market economy. And you know, the trouble with that is that very much like the other situation, the old apparatchiks want to ensconce themselves comfortably in the new system, and they want a new system that ensures they don't have to work any harder than they did under the old system. And they don't care too much about results either. And you know, you've got your reformers on one side, and you've got the nomenclature on the other, and it's a difficult area. But yeah, I think that's right.
Before we bang Mike Gilbert here too hard on this SBS, I just want to make an observation that, in fact, there are scenarios for SBS that don't require us to beg $1 trillion from the federal government, that are incremental approaches.
That's
as well.
absolutely right.
But I do have an observation on the board as well. I happened to spend some time yesterday at the board meeting, in that I found that the 32 very intelligent individuals, many of them visionaries, and it struck me they spent a hell of a lot of time micromanaging the staff, when in fact they could be setting the direction of the National Space Society instead of this organization having this discussion.
Thank you for your observation.
My favorite episode, it's actually better. My favorite episode was at the Anaheim conference, where the board spent quite some time debating a resolution to authorize Lori to buy a laser printer for headquarters.
We
Which,
have
of
3
course,
now, and I never managed to get authorization for those next
Yeah.
2, because I didn't, it was so not worth it that we got them donated from HP.
it was
Which was a shorter
It's actually-
amount of time in getting approved.
board.
Which illustrates the advantage of doing this.
Yeah, it encourages creativity. No, you know, it is, and it's a tough call because the board has had a tough time. The board has in some ways been pretty disengaged from the management of the society, and partly because of the strategic planning process, and also partly because of increased involvement by a lot of board members when we ran into financial troubles a couple of years ago, which troubles are happily more or less past. The board's become much more involved, but it's hard to establish the correct level of generality at which the board can involve. Too general, and the board's not saying anything useful at all. You know, the board said, I mean, we did have meetings where people would go and say, we should be for cheap access to space, and everybody treated that as if that was profound, and nobody spoke up for the side that, no, expensive access to space is better. But we debated this for quite a while, and oh yes, that's good, you know. Well, that's no help, you know. Yeah, we're for space colonization, rah, rah. You know, and yet, on the other hand, you have debates about whether to buy a laser printer or not, and that's not help either. And that's one of the things that I hope will be settled by the end of the strategic planning conference, is sort of the appropriate role for the board and the staff in different levels of generality and stuff. But board meetings, I've been involved in no organization at which board meetings were not a pain. I was on the board of one nonprofit that had a board of 3, and those board meetings were pretty good. But they were surprisingly bad for only 3 people being involved. And some of that is just inherent.
Yeah, I should feel free to discuss this fully. I don't feel that any of these people will take it out on me. We've all had these discussions, and I think it is an issue that we are addressing with strategic planning. Although some of the staff has been frustrated because previously I think many people on the board have been not very in touch with the society, period. Not micromanaging, but not giving any direction. Left to this, the staff has taken a lot of initiative and done direction because we wanted something to do that was positive and worthwhile, and we want to respond to the membership. We have asked for more board, stronger leadership, and this is coming about through strategic planning. What we have noticed, however, as you get the board involved, they tend to want to micromanage. And a lot of people I know are frustrated by the pace of strategic planning They have not wanted to take the time to do it, rather, oh, right, here we are, we'll get involved, we'll jump right in and clear everything up. And although some of the staff is extremely frustrated by this, it's real nice because actually we've gone to reveal, and he said, you know, this is progress. You have to look at this as progress, and at least they're thinking about it and wanting to be involved. Personally, I think 32 board members is too many. I've read in all the nonprofit books, 12 is the absolute maximum you should ever have. But our organization is a little different. And because we only have one meeting a year, the annual board meeting is the time when they all get to put in their 2 cents. And we have typically called the hospitality suite the night after the board meeting, the hostility suite, as a joke, and the staff goes up, and everyone last night at the hostility suite was asking me, are you relieved? I don't look to board meetings as something to get over. I really do enjoy the input of the board, and I recognize that by them getting involved, it's a step forward.
Let me just add to that, nobody has mentioned it yet, but the board is not appointed by anybody. The board just doesn't make themselves happen, you make the board happen. And so it's not just the 30 of us in the room, but the 25,000 members whose board it is, and so there needs to be direction up. If you don't want your board micromanaging, tell them. And if you got one who is, then just change the board member. That's that. These people, I know I'm saying this into the video camera for those that will pick up the tape and the audio. That not everybody votes. I mean, we get 10-20% of the membership that votes, and that's it. Yeah, and so we've got to be better in this organization at what we say we are, which is a democratically elected and represented organization.
And that makes us really unique. I mean, most nonprofits, the board is either appointed by the board or in effect, by the staff. I mean, most nonprofits, the board is not elected by the members in this fashion. And that makes us very unusual. And it has some distinct minuses, but I think it has some distinct pluses too, because we are a group that's organized around a particular vision that we share. And I think it helps us to remind ourselves of that.
I'd be curious if the term, we all like motherhood and cheap access to space. We all agree that micromanaging is bad, non-involvement is bad. And I'm curious as to how do you define in the reality where the line is between them? At what point is a board's right and duty to manage become micromanaged? It's not always easy to spot that line.
Keeps moving.
It certainly does. David, you're the one who made the comment. I'm curious, do you have an opinion on that one?
Well, at the very least, at the board meeting, you should gauge the activities of the organization as a whole in the last 12 months to determine whether they move the society in the direction of its goals. That's really the predominant role of the board. And as a second order, looking at the activities of the staff to see whether or not they're fulfilling the function. Things like debating for several hours which chapter gets to do the next conference. When you have a conference committee already set up to make their recommendation, you should, as a board, try to keep those activities, the time that you spend on those as short as possible, organize it as well as you can. And it can be done. I mean, clearly, other organizations do it.
And I think there are some major big picture items that were on the agenda yesterday that got very little discussion. There were no questions on the financial statements or budgets, for instance. This is really what drives the society. There's very detailed reporting. In the past, I think the treasurer and I have always felt, well, the board didn't respond because there wasn't enough information. You cannot claim that anymore. Joe Redfield, our treasurer, has done a tremendous job at laying out the budgets, and not just a bunch of detail, really outline what programs you're spending money on and so forth. And I've heard complaints from the board that they feel, well, we're not spending money where they would want to. We're given, as a staff, no direction on that. And so it's surprising to me that issues just fly by on the agenda like that. And as you say, 3 hours are spent on debating the
And it's normal
conference.
human nature, and it's really the job of the executive committee to overcome that normal human nature, not to go with the flow.
Whenever awards are on the agenda, I stop putting them on because it takes several hours for the board to discuss not who should get the award, but the structure. And again, we have a committee, we work that by committee now.
We all spend time chewing on things that we like to eat.
But we also have a tendency to discuss at great length whatever is first on the agenda, and whatever's second and whatever's third, and by that time, the time is up, so whatever was last on the agenda doesn't get discussed. We might consider putting them on in order.
So someone should consider that from the board. I mean, I do the agenda because I am given no direction by the board. And obviously, the staff reports that I put first could easily be at the end. There's no reason to discuss them because they've been handed out.
Yeah, I was actually going to suggest putting new business at the first of the agenda because every board member, well, actually last year's board meeting seemed to run fairly smoothly by comparison, but most of them, you always wind up cramming that in at the end.
I had put times on the agenda that Buzz and I had, and we intended to have a 2-hour block of time at the end. We obviously, the two big things were at ASTRA conferences that we spent 3 times as much time as we wanted.
I mentioned earlier Margaret Jordan's work, and I think this is a perfect example. I'd like to ask the board to do a lot more of using your connections, your sources of information, scouting around for places where we can do a little bit to make a big difference.
Did you tell everybody what Margaret Jordan's thing is?
Well, part of the problem is I don't know all the details, but from what I understand, she got in touch with the Pacific Rocket Society, who is working on a sounding rocket capable of reaching 50-mile altitudes, and arranged for the National Space Society to make a small in massive terms, contribution to that effort.
She raised $10,000 from directors and a couple of chapters. I'm one of them.
Yeah.
And it was done pretty quickly and effectively. And our feeling was not only is this sort of neat on its own, but it also, hopefully, the Pacific Rocket Society plans to reach an orbital flight in the next few years. And our thought was that an amateur orbital flight really resets the mind of people who presume that you can't put anything in orbit without a massive government program costing billions of dollars. And one of the things we've been thinking of doing, because there are other people working this as well, is perhaps trying to establish a prize for the first person or group to put an amateur payload in Earth orbit.
I guess it's time for me to know, as president of the California Space Development Council, that CSDC has now sponsored a competing group to place the first amateur payload into legal space. And then our entrant, which is the Northern California group, intends to get there before the NSS entrant does.
I heard someone
Feed me again!
I heard someone tell Margaret this, and that was her response too. She said, great, that's what we were hoping would happen. This was a fairly unique initiative that I think could be a model for future things. And what it took was a board member, Officer Margaret, who spearheaded this project. She worked with headquarters to raise the money. We gave her the necessary tools she needed to do that, but she has worked this herself. Now, because she did that, yes, there were concerns. There wasn't a complete competition for who the Rocket Club was. We did get calls from Northern California. They were upset they hadn't been given a chance to bid. That's tough when you just go and do a project, but when we have a volunteer who's willing to actually do a project and raise the money, we can't tell them, oh, you got to go bid it or you have to fly it a certain way. So hopefully this will come off. We probably could care less who wins. As long as someone makes it, it would be ideal.
Let me just add as a footnote to that as Linda had said, I really believe that we should not be so elated at the opportunity to put something into space, internationally accepted space above 80 kilometers, and let that be all that we're after, or something into orbit via private funds and amateur efforts. That something should be meaningful. And the Experimental Spacecraft Society as perhaps a starting point for payloads Wouldn't it be nice to have a National Space Society or a public advocacy group anyway, payload, in fact, doing the orbiting of the Earth launched by a amateur vehicle? I think that kind of objective, not just getting there, but getting there meaningfully, is ultimately important. I mean, we all reflect back that footprints on the moon were glorious, and we all reveled in that until suddenly we looked around and said, well, what does that mean? And we all want to go there to stay, and we want it to be us. So let's think of what we're going to do with that. And we can do it cheap. I mean, we know we can do it cheap. We can put a payload up there cheap.
I have to go. I appreciate all your questions, and I encourage anybody who has questions during the year to contact me. I'll be flying it well below 80 kilometers.
Greg?
Jumping back to kind of the board issue, I had a question related, I think. Yesterday, listening to the staff report, your financial report, we have kind of a financial history as a society that can be characterized in the past as crisis and as in the present as, if not adequate, almost flourishing. I think was some of the terms I heard yesterday. Are there any plans to institutionalize any of that in a more formal endowment program for the future for the society?
I haven't been given any direction to do that per se. As I mentioned yesterday, we have an educational foundation, and because we have the opportunity now to pay our expenses within our budget and possibly do some of our fundraising for specific projects, I will be recommending to the board that we use that foundation specifically for projects and do more project-oriented fundraising. Not necessarily that fund would serve specifically as an endowment using the interest, but at least it would be a separate fund not used for operating funds. Mm-hmm. Specifically, there have been a number of projects, things that have come up that people want the Space Society's involvement with, but the proceeds, they don't want to go to the general operating fund. You know, they would give you the benefit of their event if it were to go to a specific educational foundation. And the society has one that we have not been using actively, so I hope we can activate that. As far as a more long-term endowment, several years ago, I think when Charlie was chairman of the executive committee, we set up a goal of having a fund that would have at least, I forget how many, I think 4 months expenses in it at all times. The board's not addressed that because it hasn't been something that we could do. Going bi-monthly with that Astor is really what solved our financial difficulties. And because we've now caught up, clearly you're on the track to continue to accumulate income over expenses. And I think a great deal of thought needs to be put into what do we do with that income. As was discussed yesterday, the plan for this year will be to put it into membership growth. Beyond that, I think we need to look at next year's budget seriously. I'm not sure the board will choose an endowment. Given all the paths we have, it's very hard for the society to do anything other than spend their money on valuable projects.
Rick, I think there are at least a couple of board members who are behind the scenes on their own, trying to put together a strategy to create a significant endowment for the organization. But to do so, that strategy, as we have talked about it, entails doing it from sources that the society has not got access to at the moment, and that would be specifically focused on an endowment of some size, some significant size. So there's some conversation going on, and some very solid intent and desire to do that. But we're trying to get our hands around it.
Thanks.
The congressional testimony that was printed in Ad Astra I thought was very eloquent, particularly the last part about why space. Is there any intent to seek wider publication of some of that?
That's a good question. Glenn Reynolds did write that testimony, at least the first draft. I presented it to Congress, and it has been very well received. Obviously, hundreds of copies were printed for that day and distributed to the press. We wanted to do the wide distribution of Ad Astra, but since we've done that, I have gotten a number of calls at headquarters asking for exactly that. I'd be interested in doing that. We could probably do a reprint of the way it was printed in Ad Astra, stripping in folio or something, for wider distribution. There's just been so much interest. I think we ought to look into doing that.
One of the thoughts that we had after seeing that testimony was that with Space Week 25th anniversary coming up, one of our plans was to try to get with our local media and interest them in having us provide them with sidebar material or Sunday supplement material. If this could be reworked and edited and perhaps excerpted so that we had a ready-made article to take them and say, hey, this is something you can run for Space Week, that's a real opportunity that is coming up right now.
Okay. It was a real opportunity. I should mention, I don't know if the article noted, but that was the first hearing in the Congress on NASA this year. Dan Golden testified that day. There were 3 of us. And he, in fact, even called me afterwards and expressed how much he liked it. He didn't stay to hear it, but he did receive it. And several of the NASA people from Legislative Affairs did stay. So that was a real nice opportunity. And we were asked, I should say, just about a week before to testify. Typically, we're begging to testify, but I wait until I have the membership survey results back. But the staff director on the committee specifically asked us, he said, oh, when do you have your results? He said, it hasn't even been mailed yet. He said, well, could you come and then send the results for the record? Because they had the American Legion speaking that day as well. We want another pro-space public group. Glenn Reynolds got that together within a few days so that I could have it to review it and so forth. We did all that within a week. So we can be a responsive society, and I know the Congress was impressed by that. You think, as far as a reprint, you'd like an edited version better?
Well, something that would be perhaps,
as an article?
you know, of the appropriate length for either a sidebar, that'd be having to really edit it down, or a Sunday supplement kind of deal, something that we could send as a press release or you know, and tie it in with Space Week specifically.
As an op-ed piece.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
A handout would be nice as well.
Pardon?
A handout to give to people.
Right.
Would it work better? It could be in the Ad Astra format. It could be, it's also, of course, part of the congressional record, so it could be presented as formal government-type record stuff, which would be more effective.
I think for chapters and activists, and specifically, the 2 versions would be most useful would be, you know, in some sort of brochure or handout format, so when we're dealing with the general public directly, because it, you know, it's something you can take home and read at your leisure. But then there needs to be a version that's perhaps somewhat condensed or edited to really get at the, you know, the strong points for newspaper publication, like David says, you know, the op-ed, that's what I'm saying, Sunday supplement, kind of the op-ed page where it might be able to run real long. Maybe there could be another version that would be sidebar length. Because there's, you know, going to be all this media attention one way or the other on the 25th anniversary retrospective. And we ought to try to take advantage of it and get our message in as...
Yeah, there's another op-ed we're trying to place for the week of Space Week, which is on the Moon Treaty. And we've made some progress with that. Glenn is writing the op-ed. We've already gotten Space News to agree to print it that week of their special Apollo 25th anniversary supplement. The opinion piece will be on the Moon Treaty, trying, you know, to again focus on our own issues. But that's probably the place to focus on our own issues. We want the community thinking that way. Also looking where else we can get that placed. It's a good idea to have another one. I know Buzz, for those of you who've heard his talk, has a piece that he's been working on for the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts to sign together, and it talks about the future. He read about, and it's 5th draft right now here at the conference. He is working on placing that, and we'll be helping him as well. If the other 2 guys don't sign on, it'll go under his name, but ideally it'll be the 3 of them, and it's a nice future-looking message as well.
Don't we all have the opportunity to go home to our own communities, depending on the size of the community and the attitude of the paper and all, and say to them, here's something one of your local residents did. We went to Canada and we went to the Space Development Conference, and here's some things we're thinking about. And just do it as a little tiny local news thing, but it's a little more big. Couldn't everyone do that?
Sure.
I just want to talk to you folks maybe hear about the Apollo 13 proposal. I sent it to David Brandt as part of a CC that went into various chapters, and David mentioned to me in passing that he would mention it at the board meeting, when right over my head that he was actually going to sort of present it. And so I just want to sort of clear up any questions you might have, and also talk to the chapter people here about the nature of the event. Basically, in case anyone doesn't know, Tom Hanks is going to appear in a movie early next year about the flight of Apollo 13. He'll play Jim Lovell. The movie is being produced by Universal Studios. And the idea simply is to tie NSS into that movie, of course, with one of the assumptions of NSS not going to spend any money. What we bring to Universal Studios is the fact that we have a chapter system of 50 chapters around the country in the various media markets, and that we can provide them enormous amounts of free publicity, plus the possibility of having Tom Hanks here on the cover of a badass dressed in a moon suit and doing an interview with the National Space Society might help circulation or pass around of that magazine. So the proposal is to work with a major aerospace company, at this point it would be Northrop, since they own Grumman, which produces a lunar module, to work with the movie studio to produce a little brochure that would have the artwork of the movie on the cover, Tom Hanks, a lunar module, the name of the movie, and to essentially print up as many of these as the aerospace company will print for free for us. And the brochure would contain several pieces. One is a list of the acronyms to be used in the movie, and there are going to be a lot, nobody's going to understand it. Secondly, a nice piece on the lunar module itself, what it is, and how people in the movie who are attending the movie understand the movie a little bit better, and an NSS membership form. The theory is that the chapters will, at the premiere weekend of the movie, pass these out to people waiting in line who have nothing better to do than to look at this or going into the theater. If those theaters don't participate, we could drop it off at the theater and have them distribute it themselves to people walking. This is commonly done in the movie industry. And my feeling is we could probably print for free and distribute 100,000 of these to people who we would have to pay money normally to reach.
Just a sidebar on that we did a tie-in with Star Trek VI opening, and we found when we approached the theaters, they said, boy, we'd love to have you come and do something. Our publicity people at headquarters are always thrilled when we can get local people to help us promote a movie. So
and the
I think
key is
this
it would
a
have
great
the
idea.
artwork of the actual movie these people are attending.
Yeah.
This wouldn't be, it would be an obvious time.
The board discussed it, as you know, and one of the questions that we wanted to get answered was how would the other chapters respond? Could we get some commitment up front that the other chapters will in fact run with the
obviously
idea?
is a key issue. There's no question about that.
And perhaps you could participate in trying to generate those answers.
Absolutely.
Because if they'll sign on to it, it makes a whole lot of sense. If they're going to end up sitting in somebody's back room.
Absolutely.
David, I also mentioned at the board meeting that one of the events we're sponsoring for the 25th anniversary of 11 is in Los Angeles on July 18th. And Ron Howard has bought a table, and supposedly Tom Hanks will be there, and their only request was that we put Jim Lovell at their table. And so that's an opportunity we can have to talk to them about this initially and get a reaction. I don't have any contacts at Northrop, but I do at Grumman. So obviously Northrop Grumman now.
And Northrop is in LA.
Yeah, so you could make that contact. So assuming they come to the dinner, I'll talk to you before that, but I'd be willing to at least approach them there.
So step one, as Alan says, is to work with the chapters, essentially to find out how many flyers they need and determine the level of commitment. But, and also one of the factors I would assume that NSS would buy off on is that when a chapter gets the brochures, that they would stamp the little chapter logo on each and every NSS membership, and if that gets mailed into headquarters, NSS would rebate the chapters.
That wasn't discussed, because I don't think it'd be a problem. Printing it might be a problem with all the different logos, so they'd have to stamp it themselves.
They'd have to stamp it themselves, and if they don't bother, then they don't get the rebate.
Right.
I wonder if Universal isn't a better source of funding than Grumman and Northrop.
Well, I'm only suggesting Northrop in this case because we have a precedent of the aerospace companies in LA allowing us to use the printing presses for jobs that are specific to them. And I suspect there wouldn't be much difficulty getting Northrop to produce a packet that essentially is about a Northrop product.
Thank you.
you. Just to get back to those financial issues, one of my sort of personal concerns as an NSS member over a period of years, and this is not speaking as a board member, is that I've often been reluctant to give large sums of money to the society because, and I'll say specifically what happened. I was at a board meeting which a very large sum of money came into the society and it disappeared instantly into filling a previous debt. And I don't quarrel with the morality of paying the previous debts and all that sort of stuff, but it suggested to me that I could have come in and given $1 million to the society and it could have easily gone to do no new project whatsoever.
Debt at the moment.
What? Well, okay, but there's a mortgage and so on and so forth. And I personally am an advocate of fundraising for specific projects, dedicated funds, all that sort of stuff. And the failure to do that leads to a society whose purpose is to pay off the mortgage, and which is sort of a clubhouse society. And that, I don't think we really want that. So that's certainly one concern I have, that there should be a way to give members greater assurance that when they do contribute significantly to particular projects, the funds will in fact be spent on those projects. I guess for this very same reason, I've also tended to be an advocate of a arm's length foundation. I believe there at one point was a Warner von Braun fund, which I think was totally sucked up into current expenses.
It bought the building.
It bought the building, right. Now maybe that's a good thing, okay, and I'm not criticizing that decision, but if I were to contribute thousands of dollars to a foundation, I would want it to be legally structured so that could not be done. In other words, so the society could go bankrupt and the foundation would never be touched. Anyway, I'm just saying that's my personal concern in this area. Thank you.
I'll take both those points. The von Braun Fund was set up at the beginning of the National Space Institute. If you heard Terry Dawson speak about it, $1 million was given by the UAW in a suit with labor and management. That fund was depleted as a down payment for a building. Now, there was less than $100,000 left in the fund, and at the time of the merger, L5 had a lot of debt. We had a lot of moving expenses from the Tucson office, and we bought the building. Out of $100,000, 40 went to moving expenses and L5 society debt. 60,000 went as a down payment on a building. That was a very small down payment, and in fact, I think it could be argued was a bad decision because, in fact, we had a 5-year balloon note. At the end of that 5 years, property values had dropped, the building was reappraised, and we had to put down quite a bit more money in order to save our building. We then had to raise money from a second mortgage. We went the next couple of years in 6-month increments in order to get our finances in shape where the bank would actually give us another 5-year note. That was extremely harmful to the society in my view. We paid a lot of penalty points. It was unstable position for the staff. We never knew if we'd be moving or staying. In my view, the board paid little attention to this. I continued to work with the banks. This is not supposed to be the role of the staff. I feel very lucky that we made it through that time. We have now refinanced the building. We have another 5-year note with a 10-year option after that, and 15 years we'll be paid off and own the building if we want to stay there. Real estate is a tough thing for a nonprofit that has very little financial resources, and the von Braun Fund, 2 of the 3 officers of that fund supported buying the building, the third didn't and has gone away angry, said it was never for that, and didn't feel good about it. We have a problem as a society. If we set up another fund, then the people will feel, well, you can do something with that money that has not been approved. Your first part of the question is absolutely true. In the past, I think what you're probably referring to is the beneficiary. We were the beneficiaries of a will.
Yeah, it was $100,000.
It was $200,000.
More than I thought.
Carl Schaefer, may he rest in peace, left the society $200,000 several, 5-6 years ago. That money went to pay off debt. The executive director at that time had not been taking his salary for several years. And it was, determined that he should be paid, as some past vendors where we were in debt. We are not in this situation anymore. This is what I was trying to report to the board. We do not have outstanding loans. I've been paid, every staff member's been paid on time. There's never an issue. We do have the mortgage and the second mortgage. Those are the two loans outstanding the society has. They're obviously covered by the investment in the building. We now are in a position to raise money for project-oriented funds, and if you've noticed, we have been doing that. It's been extremely successful. I also support that direction, as does the person who does fundraising for us. The society now has an annual report we're putting together. You can always get financial statements, any member, by writing the society, but we should probably print it in the magazine as we have audited financial figures. I think we also send it to all our major donors automatically because they get quarterly reports. But for people who aren't major donors, maybe that's why they're not. So we ought to make it more widely available.
I guess that raises the question is that if you are going to do sequester project funding, it needs to be clear in the budget, which it currently isn't, I don't believe.
Well, obviously,
And that's
we have
clearly
a
a
covered
management
budget
issue.
first.
Right.
And assuming we do that, we really need to determine which projects we want to do to raise money for. Ben?
Related to that question, I can tell by various nonprofit organizers that there's plenty of money out there for nonprofit organizations to do specific projects. They won't fund recurring costs, but
Right.
project. All you have to do is write a proposal. So I assume that now that the staff has more time to do things like that, we'll be looking at writing proposals to get grants from these various nonprofit foundations.
Yes, we have a board member, Margaret Jordan, who is looking into that. We've had board members in the past, however, who've been looking into this, and there has not been progress on grant writing. The staff has written a couple grants and requests and not received the grant. The last one was with Challenger Center for an educational project. It does take a lot of time and doesn't always pay off, so it's extremely difficult to justify staff time to do that. We have some experience on the board with it. I think there is some interest. We actually now are looking for projects, and I would encourage all of you who have project ideas to submit them to the board, because the board isn't coming up with the projects, and if they're willing to write grants, that's the exact way it should happen. I think a lot of your projects may be locally based, and maybe we could help you write grants for them, grant requests. This is something, as you say, you cannot do very often for recurring costs. We did get a grant a couple of years ago for operations, but it's difficult. We can do that, and we should be doing a lot more of it, in my view.
Let me stress that if anybody out there has experience in grant writing, Margaret could desperately use some assistance in that respect and would very much appreciate help. I mean, she's good at it. She's good at it, but help would be useful.
I thought she had that, she needed projects, was the...
But both. I think both would be useful.
We could show the videos if there aren't any other questions. Let's do that. Have most of you seen the PSA? Yes. So I'll show the other one. Does anyone know how to operate this? I'll just take this. Yes. I pushed it. That's the noise. And this is going. Yep. Let me do on here. Boeing created this and just sent them free for our chapters to use, specifically on station.
Years, the achievements of the space program have helped make life better here on Earth. The technology we create in our breathtaking adventure into space always comes back to us 1,000-fold here at home. Our space program has spawned tens of thousands of technology advances that we use every day to save lives, make better products, and create well-paying, high-tech jobs for us and for our children. This great quest turns our wildest dreams into everyday realities. But at no
I hear things like NASA's less than 1% of the budget, but what was it?
The 2 cents a day thing and the football field.
Very carefully worded.
Yeah,
The
they're
space
obviously-
station
Space station.
is
A
less
lot
than
of
2
ways,
cents a day.
Yeah.
To do that.
Does it work out to 2 cents a day?
The station?
And in what sense can you
Then
say
like
the whole
which
thing
year?
is on budget, on time? I guess it's on budget because they don't have a budget set yet, really, but.
Well, there,
It's on budget, they
Yeah.
spend how much is budgeted each year.
that's all you can do, and then, you know, they budget more, and you make that, so you're also on budget. But I'm
Can't
sure
hardly
it's
criticize
calculated.
space station just on budget when our society can't stay
Right.
on budget all the time, so.
We typically say, I think, 8 cents a day for NASA, 8 or 10. I know after a television program I did on CNBC once, the reporter afterwards gave me his dime for the day, said, I'm convinced. Wow, take it back down to Washington. I'm sure they'll be real thrilled to
Lori,
get this.
is the 1 per 7 in returns that high? I didn't think it was that quite that high.
Well, those are really tricky numbers. There's these econometric studies, and I was very surprised to see that in there. I do tend to quote them in a pinch, however, as well. There have been studies showing that, but there are questions. I think
Those studies are widely quoted.
widely quoted, old, and widely disputed.
They're done by economists.
Right. That's
And I was talking to one of those economists once, and he thought he'd done it right.
Well, of course,
Yeah.
but they're debatable.
That's right.
I mean, is there a God?
He knew
I mean, is
that.
it?
He knew.
You can debate about it. You can pick your position and you can rationalize it, and that's where it is. So it is used. It's useful to people who will choose to believe it. Those who don't choose to believe it, or you can't.
What I wanted to say is, typically, when somebody asks that question to me, I point out the fact that the studies usually range from 4 to 1 to 10 to 1.
Right.
So I'll take the pessimist one. I'll take 4 to 1 any day. And that's how I turn that question.
The unfortunate vulnerability of that argument is that it's the lost investment. I mean, it may be that it pays off 7 to 1, but if we would have spent that in electronics, it would have paid off 1,000 to 1. And that's the real vulnerability of that argument.
I don't know, that
most things do not have that.
electronics is the way part
That's
of it.
true.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's so easy to get better than that, an investment.
I'm just saying, that's the vulnerability. That's what people say against it.
Does anybody want to see the PSAs? Has everybody been saturated with?
Or is it time to
You
go?
can take them.
Yep, take them in any case.
Yeah.
Take them and watch me.
Well, thank you, everybody. I know it's late to show up.